Hey guys, this is Zach with Next Tech News, and today is going to be episode 4 of Tech Questions. Today's question is going to be to see if the i3 6320 is actually a bottleneck for my GTX 1080. I just was curious if i3 processor of the Skylake generation would bottleneck one of the best GPUs of this generation as well. So let's see. Hey guys, so to do the testing and everything, basically we're going to monitor CPU usage as well as memory usage, and then focus on the game's performance. So basically to test all this out, I'm going to run a couple games and kind of benchmark between my i7 that's currently in this rig, and then I'll put the i3 6320 in the rig and see what changes. You know, if we see that the CPU is maxing out at 100% and our performance of the GPU is going way down, then obviously the GPU is being bottlenecked by the CPU because the CPU is being maxed out. I'm curious to see how this performs actually, because like you saw in the i5 versus i7 video, there's not much of a difference between the i5 and the i7 in gaming performance because games are very GPU intensive. So be curious to see if they actually need more than what this i3 gives them to still perform admirably. So we'll see. So first we're going to test out the i7 as a control. And basically, I'm going to run it through 2 different synthetic benchmarks of Heaven Benchmark and then 3D Mark Firestrike. And then I'm also going to run Doom, Rise of the Tomb Raider, Rocket League, and Overwatch to kind of see the differences between a couple different AAA title games, as well as a lighter weight game like Rocket League. So let's see. So after doing the control testing on the i7, what was interesting to find out was that the CPU usage is completely different depending on what benchmark it is or what game it is. Each one uses the CPU in a completely different way than the other. The i7 went all over the board. For example, in Doom, it was about a 35% CPU usage, and Doom had 70 frames per second, which is pretty decent. In the Overwatch game though, it was much more CPU intensive and it was 75% CPU usage with 120 FPS. And then games like Rocket League, it was very little CPU usage, 20% with 59 FPS. And then another game, Tomb Raider, was super high CPU usage, at least in the benchmark, which was 90%. But I did score an FPS of 136. So like I said, it was all over the board, but it was very interesting how different it was and how each one is completely different. 2 more frames per second counts. In the Heaven benchmark, I scored a 64.5, and then in the Firestrike Ultra, I scored a combined score of 12.87 FPS. So let's get started on the i3 and we'll compare it to this. So now I'm going to turn off the PC and put the Core i3 in there in place of the i7, and we're going to run the same tests and everything to see if it actually does bottleneck the GTX 1080. One of the best things about this case is it's essentially a test bench, because if I take off this sheet of plexi, I can literally change out the parts real easy. I don't have to take all apart a case or anything like that. It's all right there. So let me get started. So that's the i3, and that's the i7. And that's the heat shields on them. Hey guys, so now the i3 is in there, and you can see that there are only 4 threads now. This i3 processor has 4 threads, but only 2 cores. Basically, it runs at 3.9 gigahertz, which is substantially lower than the other, the i7 that we were just had in the system. But I think the biggest thing that might cause a bottleneck is going to be that it's only 4 threads and only a dual core. I feel like some games are going to struggle with only 2 cores being accessible. But let's see. The i3 in this test was extremely impressive because it actually performed very close to the i7. Not exactly. There was a slight decrease pretty much across the board, which was, of course, because it's a 4-core processor versus a dual-core processor. CPU usage went up, and of course the FPS went down compared to the i7. In Doom, for example, it was 58.9 FPS. In Overwatch, it was 117 FPS. In Tomb Raider, it was 48.25 FPS. In Firestrike Ultra, it was 12.45. In Heaven, it was 63.7. And in Rocket League, it was 58.8. So all the numbers were actually pretty close. The only number that took a massive hit was Tomb Raider. But that's also because Tomb Raider is the one game where the i3 was a bottleneck on the GPU. The i3 hit 100% usage immediately in that benchmark, and the FPS took a huge jump down from 136 to 48 in the i3. So there was a massive jump down from the i7 in that, which showed the bottleneck in that one game. And so you guys can actually see the comparison of each different game that I did between the i3 and the i7. Here's the chart. As you can see, Tomb Raider is the only one that had a massive difference, and that's because that's the only game that had a true bottleneck. So to answer the question from earlier, the i3 6320 does not look like it is causing much of a bottleneck for the GTX 1080. Basically, it looked like just one game, which was Tomb Raider, was actually bottlenecked by the i3, but pretty much the rest of the games across the board were not bottlenecked by it. What this makes me determine is basically some games are going to create a bottleneck with the i3 and the GTX 1080, but others won't. Most of those games are going to be games that are CPU intensive. Any game that requires more CPU is possibly going to be bottlenecked by the i3 because that i3 is only a dual core processor. But it is a good option still if you're on an extreme budget, if you're trying to make a gaming PC. It proved itself that it actually can perform very well for gaming, but it's not something I would still recommend if you have the money to spend on an i5. I would still stick with the i5 primarily because, yes, the i3 performed well gaming-wise, but it didn't do anything else very well. Loading times were a lot longer. Doing anything else on the computer while that i3 processor was in there was just slower. You could very clearly tell the difference. It's not worth, yes, it is quite a bit cheaper than the i5 still, but if you have the money, I would still recommend the i5 because, yes, it's not going to be a big difference in gaming performance, but in just everyday tasks, it's going to be a huge difference. So that would definitely be my recommendation to you. I hope you guys liked this video. If you have any comments or questions, let me know in the comments of this YouTube video. And if you're new to my channel, please subscribe. We are starting to build up some steam now, up to 700 subscribers, so that's huge. Thank you very much to everyone. And this is Zach with Next Tech News. See ya!